Consciousness Department. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this event. Great to see such a big room, a lively room. And it's a good problem to have when you have more people than chairs. And have to steal from the hallways. So welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers for today and the event. We have Professor Kevin Anderson here with us today. Kevin Anderson is a distinguished professor of sociology at UC Santa Barbara. He's the author of dozens of articles and essays on questions of Marxism, leftist intellectual history, social movements, and the like. He's also the author of several books, including Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism, Foucault and the Iranian Revolution, which he co-authored with his partner, Janet Afary, Marx at the Margins, here on nationalism, ethnicity, and non-Western societies, which we were just discussing has been translated into dozens of languages, including Tamil and Korean. It's really impressive global reach. And the book we're here to talk about today is The Late Marx's Revolutionary Roads, Colonialism, Gender, and Indigenous Communism, which has just been published by Verso this year. So we thought we'd experiment with a little bit of a different format for today by inviting two of our graduate students to start off the discussion. So we'll have comments to begin with from two of the PhD students in the History of Consciousness department. Anna Yegorova and Pablo Escudero are going to provide comments of about 10 to 15 minutes each, followed by a response from Professor Anderson, at which point we can open up for general questions, comments, and discussion from everyone. And we realize, of course, that not everyone in the room has read the book. Lots of people have, because it's been a book that students and faculty in our department have been reading, but many of you are new to this topic, new to this book, and so it's okay to also ask questions of clarification and elaboration about the arguments of the book. So I'll turn it over now to Pablo and to Anna to start us off with some initial thoughts and comments, and then we'll launch.
Thank you. Then I will start. In this short presentation, I would like to offer a few interpretations of the key arguments and major contributions presented by Professor Anderson in The Late Marx's Revolutionary Roads, interpretations shaped by my perspective as a Latin American and South American Andean from rural Ecuador. More broadly, I aim to make the case for why it remains relevant to think with Marx today, why there has sometimes been understandable resistance to what has been termed Marxism, and how this book might help us both understand and reconsider Marx as a crucial thinker for addressing the most pressing contemporary issues facing the world. During the last 14 years of Marx's life, and more specifically in his notebooks from 1879 to 1882, which are central to Professor Anderson's book, Marx was interested in understanding concretely what capital could expect to confront in its global expansion. As capitalism expanded across the globe, it not only took on specific forms, Irish, US, Indian, Chinese, German, among others, but also exhibited variations in relation to colonialism, race, gender, the local resistance to capital, and forms of revolution that were not directly tied to the dialectic of labor and industrial capitalism in the metropolis. What interested Marx most in his final years was the role of capitalism in the periphery in relation to the metropolis, how it revealed the structures of capitalism, the resistance it generated, and what potential alternative routes to it might emerge. In contrast to later Marx's interests, many secondary readers of Marx, including editors and scholars, beginning with Engels himself, narrowed Marx's focus on capital and class to the exclusion of other issues. At the same time, they interpreted the evolution of capitalism in the peripheries in a formulaic way, as if it followed a single universal path. By treating capitalist development at the core as a model, they projected the concrete abstractions found in capital, which themselves emerged from the European history in the context of industrial capitalism, onto the peripheries. This decontextualized approach, lacking concrete analysis in both spatial and temporal terms, ultimately reproduced the kind of Eurocentrism found in the Communist Manifesto of 1848 and the 1853 New York Tribune writings on India, famously criticized by decolonial and post-colonial scholars. Professor Anderson's work, including his earlier book, Marx at the Margins, provide compelling evidence that Marx, in his later years, developed a growing interest in non-Western, colonized, and pre-capitalist societies. This shift serves to correct the formulaic and Eurocentric trajectory adopted by some post-Marx Marxists. More specifically, Anderson highlights Marx's reversal of perspective regarding the idea of colonialism as a factor of economic progress. Rather than viewing social and historical development as a linear progression headed to a singular direction, Anderson demonstrates that the late Marx saw it as an uneven process with multiple possible outcomes. Professor Anderson focuses in this book on the concrete analysis that brought Marx closer to issues such as race, gender, the state, and colonialism, among other themes, while also emphasizing that the higher level of abstraction through which Marx developed capital is crucial, not only for grasping the peculiar nature, structure, and internal contradictions of the capital system as a whole, but also for showing that capitalism is an all-encompassing system of domination, full with violent contradictions that threaten to result both in its own negation and the establishment of communism by the proletariat, at least in the classic version. This leads me to the following question. Even if Marx's higher level of abstraction analysis of capitalism on the issues mentioned above is correct, how might a shift toward a more concrete analysis based on empirical evidence from the peripheries have modified his work? More importantly, what does this evidence tell us about how to think about capitalism today? Additionally, how does this evidence help us to value and think better about the most pressing issues of the present? To address these questions, I will begin with a few of Marx's key themes and observations. First, regarding the uneven forms of capitalism and multiple roads of social and historical development. Marx grew increasingly interested in the divergent paths capitalism was taking in Ireland, India, and the United States, as well as in the forms of subjectivity and resistance that emerged from these encounters. Regarding British colonization in India, his writings before 1853 interpreted British rule and the privatization of the village land in India as outcomes of large-scale economic forces. However, by 1879, in his notes on colonialism in India, Marx emphasized the contingent nature of British rule. These notes on colonialism remain significant for several reasons. First, colonial violence does not disappear with the advancement of capitalism. Rather, it persists in the peripheries in ways that serve the interests of the metropolitan center and the elites. Second, capital does not follow a predetermined path. It is shaped by historical and contextual contingencies. Finally, if capital is contingent, then we can assume that historical outcomes would have been different, pointing toward a multilinear conception of social and historical development. Regarding new forms of subjectivity and the loci of resistance to capital. In examining the persistence of Indian rural communes despite British land privatization in Kowalski's work, Marx emphasized that the transformation of earlier communal landholders into precarious cultivators of government land was not occurring without protest. While dominant accounts, such as those Marx encountered in the work of British anthropologist Henry Summermain, depicted the decline of communal forms in India as a settled fact, Marx observed that rural communes in various regions of Bundelkhand, central India, were not only undermined by British colonial forces, but in certain cases persisted and served as centers of active and potentially threatening rebellion. Marx's emphasis on the persistence of Indian rural communes was rooted in his observation that the loci of resistance were not emerging primarily from ancient communal forms in their pre-colonial versions, but rather from the disruptions caused by aspects of capitalist social relations imposed through British colonial rules. As noted by Professor Anders, Marx's focus on the loci of resistance as internal to capitalism also suggests that these colonial impositions were far from producing stability. Instead, they gave rise to new ways of thinking that could be the basis of new types of subjectivity and resistance. 3, regarding the revolutionary subject and global solidarity. The influence of developments in the peripheries of capitalism on Marx's later thinking is perhaps most evident in his views on revolutionary change in Ireland and Russia. Although he never changed his mind about the proletariat as a crucial revolutionary force, by 1869, he increasingly saw the impetus for revolution not moving from the core to the peripheries, but from the peripheries to the metropolis. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels asserted that the more advanced and industrially developed West would also produce the most radical revolutionary forces, which would then spread to the peripheries. in this view was accompanied by an understanding of communal villages in Russia and India as stagnant formations that blocked economic progress and undergirded Oriental despotism. However, by 1869 and 1870, after completing the first German edition of Capital, Marx began developing a new theory of revolution that placed Ireland at its center. He observed that British prejudices against Irish workers and peasants were dividing the working class, while the severe oppression of Irish peasants in Ireland could ignite an agrarian uprising capable of spreading to the core of global capitalism. The repercussions of these observations are significant in several ways. Marx began to see the dialectic of revolution in more complex terms, rather than viewing revolution as arising solely from uprisings of a unified working class within industrial capitalism and spreading outward to the peripheries. He recognized that workers in core industrialized countries had developed hierarchical attitudes towards workers and peasants in the peripheries, attitudes that ultimately blocked the potential for transforming their own conditions. Furthermore, racism and quasi-racism, far from disappearing with capitalist development, became specific forms of capitalist domination in the peripheries. These forms of oppression obstructed vital solidarity between workers across the national boundaries. To conclude, late Marx's renewed interest in capitalist peripheries did not make him an empiricist in a narrow sense. His concrete analysis on capital in the peripheries both spoke to the high level of abstraction required in capital to represent the system as a whole, and to the need to particularize this kind of universalist theorization. This relationship between the universal and the particular forms that capital takes is rooted in his well-known understanding that capital is not a thing, but a social, and I would add, political relation. If the earlier part of this presentation emphasized the living social aspects of capital, in this final section I will turn to the political. To do so, I return to the question posed at the beginning of this essay. How does the late Marx help us think about the ways capitalism impairs our capacity to organize more effectively in the face of the multiple and violent crises we confront today? To answer this, I will focus on indigenous resistance and alternatives to capitalism in the Latin American context. It is widely known that classical Marxists have paid little attention to and often regarded as unimportant the diverse and far-reaching indigenous struggles in the so-called global South, even those that are clearly anti-capitalist and anti-statist. The teleological assumption that these struggles must first pass through the dialectic of labor, or that their territorial and political organizations are necessarily pre-capitalist or external to capitalist relations, has contributed to the widespread perception of Marxism as Eurocentric. Not by accident, many indigenous pueblos and nations in Latin America, including indigenous feminism, are reluctant to embrace or openly reject so-called Marxism. The popularization of Eurocentric Marxism has had costs for both sides. On the one hand, many indigenous people and anti-colonial scholars in Latin America reject Marxism as a whole, rather than simply the Eurocentric interpretation taken by some post-Marxists. This rejection deprives them from a potentially useful tool for revealing the multiple hidden forms of direct and indirect violence, dispossession, and domination that shape capitalism's defining features. On the other hand, Marxists who fail to engage with the evolving conditions of indigenous struggles, those most affected by the capitalist world order, risk misunderstanding what capitalism is today, overlooking the forms of resistance it generates and missing potential alternatives. Let me illustrate my point with a few examples. Consider the dialectic of labor and the revolution of the proletariat. As mentioned above, some post-Marxists argue that the path toward a communist, allegedly still unknown society necessarily requires passing through capitalism, meaning the united laborers expropriating the expropriators. However, contemporary advanced capitalism outside the industrial core has created a very different experience for most indigenous peoples. For instance, take the role of extractivism in the Latin American context. Extractivism has become the dominant historical form through which most Latin American nations are integrated into the global economy. In this context, highly automated extractive operations in the peripheries, such as open pit mining in the Salario Uyuni and intensified extractivism in the Amazon, create only dispossession with no opening of labor market opportunities for those communities. In Marx's terms, this phenomenon has been interpreted as the movement from formal to real subsumption. However, In this peripheral context, this interpretation obscures at least three important aspects already present in late Marxist thinking. First, the sort of lumpen proletariat that extractivism creates in the periphery is not necessarily an expression of transition into advanced capitalism, but rather a condition that capitalism assumes in relation to specific zones of production and consumption. Second, while the notion of consumption emphasizes capitalism's constant expansion, it does not account for another structural condition, suprassumption, the production of externalities that capitalists cannot incorporate. This relates not only to labor, but also to environmental damage, such as oil pollution in fragile ecosystems. Finally, the specific form that capitalism takes in these peripheral zones of the world system also generates particular forms of resistance and alternatives to capitalism itself. Viewing indigenous struggles as in a pre-capitalist past or only as forms of negation obscures an important aspect of the specific conditions under which indigenous pueblos and nations have encountered capitalism and the politically organized alternatives they are creating. The language commonly heard in these territories rarely centers on laborers seizing the means of production. Instead, it emphasizes defending their territories, ecologies, and autonomy, not as a form of independence, but as a form of negating capitalism while affirming themselves politically in their customs and traditions. These indigenous uprisings and experiments, which have had so much doubt about some Marxist factions, deserve closer attention. Their practices and conditions might be redefining who the revolutionary subject is. Their social and political experiments, rooted in the past, incomplete, marked by internal contradictions, and constantly under threat, may already be producing alternatives to capitalism. Their struggles, which speak the language of ecology, dispossession, and autonomy, are frequently carried out in solidarity with other movements around the world, from the Amazon to Palestine. By paying closer attention to these experiments, we may also confirm what the late Marx had already seen, that capitalism is not a thing, but a social relation, one that cripples our ability to determine values for ourselves.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you everyone for coming to this event. It's great to have and great to have you as an audience. So I'll just continue with a couple more questions that we would like you to answer. So within the Marxist tradition, the late post-capital Marx did not get much scholarly attention. David Rizanov's quote from 1924, cited in your book, Kevin, is an extreme example of this attitude. Here's the quote. If in 1881, he, Marx, lost his ability for intensive, independent intellectual creation, he nevertheless never lost the ability of research. Sometimes, in reconsidering these notebooks, the question arises, why did he waste so much time on this systematic, fundamental summary? In the 63rd year of his life, this is inexcusable pedantry. You, however, claim that the late Marx is extremely important for us today. Since the 1980s, other scholars have insisted on the importance of the late Marx, primarily because these writings challenge the unilinear understanding of history, social development, and transformation. The title of your new book refers to Theodor Shanin's first major publication of Marx's 1881 correspondence with the Russian Narodniks on the fate of the Russian peasant commune, which came out in 1983. The now famous letter to Vera Zasulich revealed a shift in Marxist thinking and sparked some interest in the late Marx. In this letter, Marx talks about the Russian peasant commune as a prototype for the post-revolutionary agricultural communities. The letter to Zasulich could be, and has been, dismissed as a result of Marx's disillusionment with the revolution in France, submission to the 19th century romantic fads, as well as his concession to Narodniks, who translated his work into Russian and who Marx did not want to discourage. Yet, as you rather convincingly demonstrate, the letter is but the tip of the iceberg. You develop Raya Dunayevskaya's writing on the late Marx, who connected his interest to the communal forms, to the preoccupation with gender relations, something that is completely amiss in discussions of multilinearity up to date. Between 1879 and 82, Marx read anthropology extensively, leaving behind some 350 neatly written pages of so-called ethnological notebooks, which show that in those 3 years, Marx was particularly interested in societies impacted by colonialism: Indonesia, Latin America, Australia, Algeria, Egypt, and India. He was also concerned with communal land tenure, clan and gender relations in non-capitalist societies scattered across time and space. The reason for this curiosity can be gleaned from the second drop of the letter to Sociology. Quote, "The peoples among which capitalist production reached its highest peak in Europe and the United States of America seek only to break its chains by replacing capitalist with cooperative production, and capitalist property with a higher form of the archaic type of property, that is, collective communist property." What do you make of this shift in Marxist thinking from the core contradictions of capital to its outside? You even suggest that these notes could become yet another volume of Capital. What concerns could have motivated this shift for Marx, and what concerns of your own could this rereading of Marx address? So the first part of my question is about this specific shift, but I would also like to ask you about shifts and changes in Marxist thought throughout. For example, in Marx on the Margins, you describe how Marx changed his perception of the Irish question following the 1867 Fenian affair, as Pablo has already described. So if before Marx thought that only the revolution in England could liberate Ireland, post-1867 Marx saw the demand for Ireland's liberation as a condition for overcoming class collaborationist racism of the English worker. You also talk about the change in Marx's attitude towards colonialism. From the Communist Manifesto, while the Communist Manifesto celebrates the onslaught of capitalist production that sweeps away non-Western societies and cultures, Marx ceases to see it as a progressive force in his discussion of the 1862 Taipei Rebellion or the 1857 Sepoy Uprising in India. Yet, we could also doubt Marx's celebratory attitude towards capitalism in the manifesto as wholehearted, because the early Marx of the 1844 manuscripts was already quite critical about capital. Recall his Goethe and Shakespeare-inspired chapter on the power of money as omnipotent being. With your work, shifts and changes in the way Marx thought and wrote become particularly evident. But what do we make of them today? To be more specific, in the 20th century, preference for a particular Marx signaled one's political standing. The Frankfurt School and Herbert Marcuse turned to the young Marx to oppose Stalin's official dialectical materialism, while Althusser insisted on the importance of Capital's mature Marx to oppose the Communist Party's post-Stalin turn toward indiscriminate humanism, which coincided with the existentialist focus on individual choices. Today, when there is virtually no official party position on Marx, how do you propose to view these shifts in Marx's thought? Can we say that there is a good and bad, more and less valuable Marx? Or maybe your very extensive research can tell us something about Marx's method and hence changes in his theory. Yet, this kind of answer could be challenging to us, because then we might fall into the trap of progressivist unilinear thinking, which sees theoretical development as a gradual accumulation of knowledge. So again, are there breaks in Marx? And what do you make of them? And now my second question. Marx at the Margins and your recent book show that Marx was an avid multidisciplinary reader, and quite sure his interest was not limited to Marxism, which emerged only after his death. As Kohei Saito argues, while working on Capital Volume 1 until the 1880s, Marx read about natural science, in particular on agricultural chemistry, soil depletion, premature cattle slaughter, and climate. The issues addressed in your recent book are communal social formations, temporality in history, gender and women's empowerment, colonialism and resistance, revolutionary change, and alternatives to capitalism. What a scope! Yet, despite all the heterogeneity of issues Marx studied, they seem to connect to one another. For example, in the preface to the 1882 Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, the peasant commune in Russia is discussed in connection with the revolution in Europe. Now I quote, "Now the question is, can the Russian община, though greatly undermined, yet a form of primeval common ownership of land, pass directly to the higher form of communist common ownership? Or on the contrary, must it first pass through the same process of dissolution, such as constitutes the historical evolution of the West?" The only answer to that is possible today is, if the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that both complement each other, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as the starting point for a communist development. Another example, and to find more examples, you should please read Kevin's book. Through the very attentive reading of 1879 notes on the French colonial policies in Algeria, you show that Marx connected the suppression of communal land ownership by the French colonial administration to the Paris Commune. It is the emergence of this alternative form of social organization that is now seen as a threat to private property, capitalism, and the bourgeois state. Listen to Marx's notes referring to the 1873 French parliamentary debate. Quote, "Continued maintenance of communal property is dangerous both for the colony and for the metropolis as a form that supports communistic tendencies in people's minds." In addition to drawing the reader's attention to this contingent and at times hypothetical connections, you also show how Marx compares various phenomena across time and space. For instance, tonal connection. In his notes on ancient Rome, he compares the lack of solidarity between slaves and free plebeians during slave revolts in the first centuries BC to the white workers' racism towards slaves in the US during the Civil War. You also make a very astute observation that in the notes on Kovalevsky, Marx uses the Russian word for village commune, община, to talk about the peasant commune in India. At the same time, Marx vehemently rejects other comparisons common at the time. Remember his criticism of the political economists who find capitalist private property in non-capitalist societies, including ancient Greece, or his objections to extending feudalism to non-European contexts, especially Mughal India, which for Marx did not have feudalism. In your opinion, what place do comparison and connection occupy in Marx's method? What do they enable him to do? How does he manage to be a global thinker, connecting phenomena across time and space, and yet be mindful of particularities and specificities? While Marx's position changes over time, could we establish continuity in his method?
Thank you very much. Before I start, I edit a web journal, the International Marxist Humanist, and I publish a lot of my shorter writings in there. And so I'm sending out rather little information about it, and it's a free subscription. Anybody who wants to sign with their email. Okay, so there's so many issues, and so I'm not going to be very coherent in the way I respond. It's going to take a couple of issues and stop me at 10 minutes, will you? Because I don't want to go on forever. Okay, I want to start with our gender because, as Anna said, there is a lot of discussion of the late Marx, but surprisingly little of it is about gender, whereas as early as Engels, I mean, we can criticize Engels, the schematism and so forth, as Engels' book started with de Beauvoir, but he recognized the centrality of gender, whereas most of the other commentators did not. I mean, with the exception of my mentor, right in his crime, I think my student, Heather Brown, who did a book on Marx and gender based in the economists. So what can we say about that at a general level? This is something that Anna was already touching on at the very end with, it's true the manifesto celebrates capitalism as progressive, but you don't really see that language in the 1844 manuscript. So, and also the 1844 is one of the places where it does address gender quite profoundly in the essay on private property and communism. So one formulation, again, from my mentor is, well, actually from a Russian guy, Lichtman, that she was quoted, that Marx returns to the radicalism of the early 1840s in his late Russia. So that's just one observation. I want to start, though, with a quote. This is a letter from Jules Guetta, the French socialist who was a left-wing socialist, but then became actually a supporter of World War I later on. But that's how I joined the cabinet. But that's another chapter of his life. So at this time, Marx is trying to, recruit him to work with his son-in-law and the other. He's estranged from trying to build a Marxist party in France. This letter was discovered only a couple of years ago, but it deals with this thing about this directionality revolution, because it was referred to in terms of Ireland, but I want to refer to it more explicitly in terms of Russia. So here's part of the letter. It's a letter to Guetta. It was just discovered among Guetta's papers. I'm convinced that the explosion of the revolution will begin this time not in the West, but in the Orient, in Russia. It will first impact the other two harsh despotisms, Austria and Germany, where violent upheaval has become a historical necessity. It is of the highest importance that at the moment of this general crisis in Europe, we find the French proletariat already having been organized into a workers' party and ready to play its role. As to England, the material elements for its social transformation are superabundant, but a driving spirit is lacking. It will not form up except under the impact of the explosion of events on the continent. It must never be forgotten that however impoverished the condition of the greater part of the English working class, it takes part nonetheless to a certain extent in the British Empire's domination of the world market, or what is even worse, imagines itself to be taking a part in it. So that's delicious. I think it's a really delicious expression. Guetta responds, he makes no reference to this part of the letter at all, and just talks about the part that's about factionalism. And says, no, you're accusing me as this isn't true. Okay, so that's really important. I think that Marx, the directionality has changed. It's already changed by 1869, as you were mentioning, with Ireland, that would start making Ireland not, the core capitalist countries. But what he doesn't have in this letter yet is, the revolution is going to start in Russia, he thinks. It's going to, have physical force kind of importance. But he doesn't say what he says in 1882. It could become the starting point for a communist development. So literally, not just in terms of where the revolution starts and shakes up things, and then we get, so to speak, the real revolution in Western Europe, but a communist revolution, a modern revolution, is possible in a place like Russia, of course, by transforming this archaic communism into something modern, which he doesn't say it, but presumably it would involve the gender relations, which are not very great in those structures. Okay, so a couple other points here. Counterfactuals, I think, are very important here. As Pablo was saying, what would have happened if Ireland had extended more as an uprising and successfully in the 1860s, 70s, and the impact it could have had on Britain? Or likewise, if a revolution in Russia had broken out in the 1870s, 1880s. So Marx is really, and the way he thinks about revolution is just so different from the way the historians do, because they study particular countries. And Marx doesn't see it that way. He sees the interconnection of So many disciplines. Okay, another really, to me, and I didn't figure this out till I was almost finished with the book and had to rewrite some of the chapters. But this thing about plebeians in Rome and the Irish and then the white racism in America, because Marx has this phrase that he starts using in the 1840s. Everybody is using it. The poor whites of the South. And, in the North at that time, there was a lot of illusion that once they went into the South and dismantled there's so much fire, because a small percentage were slaveholders. The rest of the population was like waiting to be liberated. Like a lot of those whites just didn't turn out that way for them as much as they thought, although there was some aspect of that. But Marx talks about the poor whites in America and how because of racial politics, they have more affinity to the white ruling classes sometimes than to any kind of solidarity with the black former slaves. Okay, that's a well-known thing throughout his Civil War writings. What's less known, or a little bit known, is that when he's writing about the Irish in Britain, he says, well, the English workers, similar to the poor whites of the American South, look down on the Irish and won't unite with them, accuse them of lowering wages and all this stuff. What he also does that nobody knows about, because this stuff hasn't been published yet, in the notes on Rome, which I think will be about 100 printed pages when they're published, and we hope to publish those soon. He says, yeah, these Roman plebeians, because they're all the plebeian uprisings under the Gracchi brothers. And that's people, I don't know how people know, but there's a whole other series of slave revolts way before Spartacus. There's a series of slave revolts in Anatolia and southern Italy. And so Marx says these poor whites, they have this attitude toward the former slaves, and they won't unite with them. So there's a quasi-racism. We could say maybe in Max Weber's terms that it's related to status of privilege and anxiety. That I think it's just really interesting the way he was looking at it. And I want to make clear one of the things that maybe isn't obvious in my books, because I only really started to think about it after this book was finished more, that when Marx is when he's criticizing the poor whites of the South, or when he's criticizing the English workers towards the Irish, let's take that example as the key one, because that's where he writes the most. He's writing this as a leader of the First International. He's writing at a time when they've actually organized solidarity demonstrations of English workers with tens of thousands of people in London to support clemency for Irish political prisoners who have been accused of murdering English police. 40 or 50,000 show up, and the London Times says, oh, all the rough element of the city gathered all in one place, dangerous classes. They managed to do that. So Marx said, take our resolutions. We have to go into the Irish community. Let's go into New York and New Jersey and try to see if we can win the Irish immigrant workers over to socialism, because they were, not exactly flocking to join. So my point is, Marx is not saying give up on the poor whites or the English workers, that they're like permanently racist or whatever. These are political documents about organizing and changing politics. And that the one on Russia also is a political intervention into Russian politics, that he wants those who consider themselves socialists and his followers not to be so dogmatic in rejecting the populist movement, among a lot of other things he's doing. I didn't develop this in my book enough, but I think it's really important. These are alternatives to capitalism, especially it comes out, I think, in the part of the ethnological notebooks that says about gender relations among the Iroquois and some of these other indigenous societies. And it's so important. And I want to quote on that some of the older people in the room like me might remember the name Edgar Morin, certainly in France, one of the most famous social thinkers, as famous as, I was in France a couple of years ago, and the bookstore had the newest book by Foucault in the window, and right next to that, a stack of the newest book by Edgar Morin, who went all the way back as a teenager to the resistance. But he wrote an essay toward the end of his life, he died very recently, that, when we were starting to think about resisting in 1940 and 41, the biggest problem we had was that the Nazis had like swept over everything. And they were looking like they were going to take Britain too. There was just utter sense of hopelessness and powerlessness. And it was really hard to grasp any kind of alternative to the existing situation. Once we start to grasp that, then we could start to fight. And there's a hypothesis on similar. Okay, a couple other things. Yeah, I think Pablo, you're really onto something here with this formal versus real subsumption, and how complicated and maybe even wrong that becomes when you look at when you look outside Europe, the permanent existence of groups that could have been called lumpen proletariat, and then other issues that you raise. Yeah, and then what about, what does it all mean for today? I think the way both of you put it, that Marx was looking at all these varying things, but as Anna was saying to the end, it's somehow connected. There's somehow a continuity as well. So I think if we look at either Russia or Ireland, what we can see is, in the US, broadly speaking, in the last 10, 15 years, we've had two main wings of the left. One has been DSA, Bernie Sanders, billionaire class, capitalism, economic inequality. And the other is what is pejoratively referred to sometimes as the DEI or wokist left. And it's being persecuted directly on the campuses today. But I think Marx tells us in his late years that we can't just exclude, as Marxists, we can't exclude what's called like the DEI left. And then from the other side, that they can learn something from looking at capital and in class. So that's the continuity in Marx, certainly, because he is a Hegelian in the sense that he's always looking at the totality, at the level of capital, global, and so forth. But his resistance to any kind of a abstract universe at the same time. And I don't think we can blame the abstract universal on Hegel. I mean, I remain a convinced Hegelian to it, not Hegelian, but I don't subscribe to, the whole of Hegel quite as much as with Marx. But remember the preface of the phenomenology of what we can't paint the universal as a night in which all cows are black. And he's resisting the accusation that that's what he's doing, that the universal has to particularize itself. And so you can't just have a cookie cutter thing where you say capital, labor, and then go to India or go to Algeria or Native American. So I think that would be constant, looking at capital, looking at class, and all these research projects are, I think they're always connected to political and organizational projects as well. And I don't think it's correct to say that Marx turned more intensively to outside Europe in the 1870s and early 1880s. Because I think in the 1850s, he turns to it a lot. And there's a lot that is not published or known. Because we certainly know about the writings on India and China that have been well publicized for decades, because those were published in the Tribune and so forth. But like, for example, he wrote about 10 or 20 pages of notes on Prescott, who wrote a history of the Incas and then the Aztecs. And so Marx was already looking at that in like 1852, 53, that there's these notes. And they're in the Marx-Engels-Gesamtschau already, if anybody wants to look at them. But so he was looking at it, but he was looking at it in a very different way. He would say things like, the communal village in India is the most solid foundation for Oriental despotism. that you have to get beyond this, what he would have called then primitive collectivism, toward a more modern individualism, go through all that stuff, and then have a liberatory socialist movement. But his attitude really shifts on that kind of archaic communism, as he called it, by the end of his life. And he even sees elements there that were pointing to gender equality also when you go back to at least some of the Native American variants of that. So I could say more, but I think I went on. You didn't. It was generous. I don't think you told me my attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's open it up to the room and questions, comments, thoughts, reflections, responses to anything else that you said.
So thanks for coming. Marx at the Margins also is very, very, very important to me. And when I was a graduate student here at HistCon, I taught the Marxism class, and this book was indispensable to writing my lectures. And I assigned it to a lot of students. So, you have a presence here before coming. I wanted to ask you about the intervention that your book is making into debates surrounding Marxist theory of revolution. And in your new book, you identified three concepts of revolution in the late Marx. But the one I wanted to ask you about is the one that actually hasn't been addressed really by Anna or Pablo, so that's good. And it's in his writing on the Paris Commune and the critique of the Gothic program. And you argue that the late Marx, quote, moved even further away from the notion that communism, in abolishing capitalism, would involve any form of state instead of its complete abolition, end quote. But rather than, say, tracing the development of Marxist thinking on the state, it seems like Lenin's theorization of transition and state and revolution becomes kind of your main target here. So first, could you say more about the issue here? That is the problem with equating the first phase of socialist transition with the dictatorship of the proletariat. And then second, can you provide some historical context for why Marx and Engels described in their late work the centralization of credit, communication, and transportation in the hands of the state as, quote, outmoded revolutionary measures?
Answer this one,
Up to you, whatever you want. There's two other questions you can gather, or we could take another question or another one.
It's up to you. You decide. Me? I don't know how many people want to speak.
Sure. So we have a question from Max. Let's take the questions two at a time. Got Max, Banu, and then Mary on Zoom.
Okay. So I think methodologically, thank you, Kevin. There's a methodological question that is about the two books on Marx and the relationship between, let's call it the empirical and the theoretical. Mm-hmm. Because if we look at the history from a theoretical perspective, that can be more or less Hegelian, teleological, or in any case based on the linear historical temporality, then we can see forms of production in what Marx investigated in India and elsewhere as a non-capitalist, but because of the unilinear historical temporality, because of that assumption, they become pre-capitalist, pre-modern, and so on. And then theoretically, one can say, and Marx say for a while, especially in the 50s, that they have to be modernized, or even more in the 50s, he wrote that British colonialism has a civilizing mission to accomplish in India. One can also go the other way around, but I think it's the same assumption. And instead of thinking in terms of civilizing free capitalist formations, one can romanticize that. I think it's exactly the same thing. So it's the assumption is the same unilinear understanding of history. So what Marx is doing, I think, is something else. And if I remember correctly, we had a similar conversation in London probably 12 years ago. And so the point is that Marx does something really smart. That is basically he plays with this relationship between the theoretical and the empirical, in which the empirical, the fact that there are coexisting forms of exploitations. Some of them can be called advanced, and some of them can be called residual, are not really advanced or residual. So Marx understanding of the coexistence of different historical forms. This is my first ritual act at the theoretical level. And then Marx has to redefine its theory so that in the 60s, he abandoned the idea of Gesamtkapital, the capital in general. That was the formal assumption in the Grundrisse. And he has to move in a new direction, 61, 63, that is the competition of capitals, in which basically at the global market, what you see is that how different forms of exploitation are reciprocally combined. And I think again, what is interesting is that methodologically Marx is able to do this thing, to rethink a theory from the empirical and redefine the theoretical framework so that the theory can readdress the empirical or the concrete in a new way, with also different political outcome. So at a certain point, he stopped writing that the British colonialism has a civilizing mission. And when he goes back to India, he only sees the destruction and famine.
Thank you, both of you. Yeah, Master's question is a tough one, and I'm going to respond indirectly, maybe a little base. Okay, one of the big empirical things that Marx experiences between Grundrisse and Capital is the re-explosion of the revolutionary movement in Europe. We don't think of it that way, but he probably thought of the Civil War in the United States as a revolution. And if so, it was the greatest in terms of empirical impact because it had a partial victory. So you have that, you have the Polish uprising of 1863. And so part of the road from Capital to Grundrisse is that human agency or subjectivity, which is almost absent in the Grundrisse and the Critique of Political Economy, reasserts itself. And you get like the Working Day chapter that we were talking about. You get the writing on Ireland at the end of the Accumulation chapter, where he mentions the Fenian uprising and so forth. So, but he doesn't, then he goes back into the dialectic. And in the preface to the 1867 edition, he does two things. First of all, he says that look at the United States, where division of the land is on the agenda. He's talking about what we call today 40 acres and a mule, which would still look like it might be possible in 1867. But the first page or so, he says, we can only grasp a commodity through the power of abstraction. So he has to go to a very high level of abstraction at the same time. And how he does that, I wish I knew. Okay. Jerry's question is on the surface simpler, but not really. What does Marx think about the state? Well, clearly at the time, as late as the Civil War and early Reconstruction, he's very happy that the modern centralized state is coming into this retrograde area of the U.S. South and modernizing those institutions and so forth. But by the time of the Paris Commune and after, there's a shift away from that. Now, again, we can go back to 1840s and see really fierce denunciations of the state. But some by the time of the manifesto, that disagree. Of course, you have to remember the manifesto is a manifesto. It's a group text. Possibly, the people in his organization even believe in the state much more than he and Engels did. And so he has some of that language for that reason. Because Terry Eagleton, no, not Terry Eagleton, that novelist, writes for
Morris. Morris?
No, the contemporary guy. China Mieville. He says, you have to realize the manifesto is like an address to the troops to fire them off. It's not like, we're going to win. We have a world to win. It's not a sober analysis of entirely English or elements of it. Okay, so, Marx says Marx and Engels say in the 1872 preface to the manifesto that we have to change a couple of things, and they refer to that section at the end of section 2, I think it is, where they have a bunch of like empirical proposals, like we need graduated income tax, really revolutionary things that, well, actually, I think we do have to defend them again. Free public schools for everyone. That's a communist demand. So they have all those things, and yes, centralization of the state, centralization of credit in the hands of the state. That's probably the kind of thing they're talking about eliminating. So what is going on there? Because you can see it in the critique of the Gotha program too, where they lash out. Marx lashes out at the idea of public schools under the control of the state, which is different from funded by the state. He makes a big distinction of Latina. Okay, and then Lenin, I don't want to mean to I still really respect Lenin. I guess I wrote an essay on Lenin that's supposed to appear. There's going to be, believe it or not, a Cambridge companion to Lenin that's not going to have any hit jobs. I would never have believed that possible. So Michael Lowy pointed this out, that as late as 1906 or 7, the essay that Lenin writes on 2 roads of social democracy, he says what they all still thought at that time, that Paris Commune really wasn't a very positive thing. They weren't organized. So Lenin himself doesn't come around to celebrating the Paris Commune until the Soviets appear on a big scale in Russia in 1917. Then he writes State and Revolution in the summer and early fall of 1970, or summer of 1970. Okay, so you have to give him credit, because without that, I don't know if we could even today be reading the Civil War in France. And because of that, now emphasized it also for his own reason. So Lenin recognized the importance of that. He certainly recognized the idea of direct workers' democracy. But what he misunderstood, and I think there are a lot of consequences to this, is Marx says 2 phases, but there's really 3 of post-revolutionary society. And we have a new edition of that I worked on, of the critique of the Gotha program with P.M. Press. If you want to look at that, we try to parse all that. And Peter Hudis is the one that really developed this. But the dictatorship of the proletariat is a transition. This is maybe Du Bois thinks similar to the Reconstruction governments in the South, where certain people were excluded from political participation for a while, or even the Paris Commune itself, where the bourgeois fled and the plebeian classes were in charge of the city. But then, like the Paris, let's take the Commune. The Commune still had wage labor, and whereas with already the first phase of communism in the critique of the Gotha program, you have this remuneration on the basis of number of hours worked, but wages are not mentioned. And so that if you want to call that the first post-capitalist phase, the transitional phase, that's the dictatorship of the proletariat, or some kind of transition, still seems to have a state, possibly still has wages and so forth. Then the first phase of communism, even the first phase, has no state, has no wages, has this remuneration based on intensity or time of labor. Then the third one, which is called the second stage of communism, is the one we all know the phrase, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. So that's how Lenin conflated 1 and 2. So therefore you got the state back under communism, which I don't think you can find in Marx. Even in the Communist Manifesto, the state that's in order to consolidate the revolution. It's not, I think there's still an idea of a non-state off in the future. So the state, if we look at the two main strengths of socialism of the 20th century, the Social Democrats and the Orthodox Communists, they both really believe in the state, and they're at variance with Marx and Engels too.
Great. We have a question from Banu and then Mary Johnson.
Thank you, Robert. Kevin, thank you so much for being here, for your work. This is a very, very important resource for all of us. You know, when I grew up and was coming into political consciousness, the Turkish left was consumed with debates about the Asiatic mode of production, looking at the history of the Ottoman Empire and the process of anti-colonial warfare from a country that was always semi-peripheral, like not entirely colonized, but also with an imperial history of its own. These categories were extremely difficult to fit on the historical reality of the Ottoman Empire in the broader Middle East. And a lot of those discussions happened without access to the writings that inform your book today. And they were based on extrapolations from the well-translated writings of the around the time of the Communist Manifesto, the Grundrisse, and Capital. So a lot of third world Marxism and the subaltern school, etc., developed out of imperfect and incomplete readings of Marx and tried to grapple with the realities of the periphery or the third world. So my question to you is, how do you situate your take on the late Marx and your reconstruction of the late Marx vis-a-vis those developments that had no access to these writings, but access to a reality, a historical reality that didn't quite fit these categories or had to be made to fit them with a great amount of theoretical and political effort with enormous political consequences? Because you can imagine every interpretation of these concepts leading to different strategic and tactical choices for on-the-ground movements and intellectuals informing them. So how would you situate your take in relation to some of those developments? And I know that this is a very broad question, but I would really love to hear your thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Mary, on Zoom.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also really appreciate this book, and I'll say, you know, maybe this is very dorky, but I often go back to Theodore Shannon's text in the interview, the sort of letters with Vera, and I find actually reflecting on Banu's just last question, it's always so interesting to me how timely or how like circular history is, and the debates. You know, it's so striking in her letter how she says, I thought I would write to you directly, because when I say that we need to defend the Russian commune, my comrades tell me no, and I tell them why, and they said, because Marx said so. And you know, she calls them something like the so-called Marxists, and then she refers to him. She says, so I thought I would go to him, and she like writes him in capital letters, or anyways, it's this way in the translation, right? So so I just really appreciate this talk so much. And the question that I kind of keep coming back to is sort of two things. You know, one, to me, both in that exchange and in the kind of other writings that you've, you know, the kind of the writings on the Haudenosaunee and the kind of ethnological notebooks, it seems to me that at the heart of this question is actually a question of social reproduction, and of how, like, revolution is actually about social reproduction. How do peoples reproduce themselves outside the context of these exploitative systems? And the other person who, of course, wrote so much about social reproduction is Engels. So my question is really, why do you think that Engels went on and sort of didn't, took us all in a very different direction afterwards, after these exchanges? And that's like a question that's often been in my heart. So I thought I would see what you thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take Mary's comment first. Yeah, obviously, you first have to admit that there are problems in Engels, which in academia is never a problem. But I also go to like these historical material conferences in London and other, and as soon as you mention anything about Engels, like 10 hands go off, and so it's almost like you can criticize Marx more than Engels, because once you criticize Engels, it goes from Marx to Engels to Lenin, and then wherever. And if you mess that chain up, then you're delegitimizing Lenin and whoever afterwards some of these people are following. So, yeah. Okay. Engels actually, he publishes an edition of the Communist Manifesto, I think in the 1890s, where he has all these prefaces, including the one you were just quoting about the Russian Община on the basis for communist development. He has a long new preface of his own, doesn't mention it whatsoever. But at the same time, he writes a letter about Dutch colonialism in Java, having looked at Marx's notes. And by the way, we're going to publish those, by the way, too, soon. And what the book Marx reads, but I don't think he agrees with, but Engels reads the notes and seems to agree more with the book. The author says, well, but unlike the English, the Dutch didn't try to mess with the communal villages much. They didn't try to create private property in the village. And Indonesia has been a model of stability and profit for the Dutch. Isn't that great? And so Engels looks at it, yeah, it's still the position of the 1850s that these communal villages are a linchpin for class rule. And then the second thing that's really, you could argue about that one, but what's really glaring is something happens a year after Marx's death, which is there's the Congress of Berlin, and they sit with a map and they carve up Africa, 1845. And the most, Leopold gets Belgium. I mean, I think most of us know that. I don't know of any writing by Engels on this or those other socialists at the time. They just ignored this. So that's a real difference. So, yeah, because Marx said so, I mean, it would be stupid to ever say that. At the same time, since a lot of what Marx wrote, including those letters to Zazulich, which were not published until 1911 or something, and even the manifesto preface was translated into German, was published in German, they wrote it in German, was translated into Russian. That was ignored. There's no commentary on that. So, yeah, there was a Catalan who'd read Marx at the margins, and he was arguing, he quoted Marx that, the national autonomy is a principle for Marxism. So, Communist Party member wrote to him, this was carried out in one of the newspapers in Spain, and he said, oh, well, comrade, I mean, we never quote Marx verbatim because Marxism is a growing body of ideas and we have to interpret it. So think more of the Roman Catholics, where you don't go and read, you're not encouraged to read the Bible. You're encouraged to the Pope, the most recent Pope and his teachings. But we can go back to what Frantz Fanon, as far as Turkey, the Ottomans, what Frantz Fanon said about them, which is that when Marxism goes outside Europe or goes to Africa, it has to be stretched. But of course, Fanon is talking about the Marxism that he knew. I think we can also stretch our understanding of Marx himself, which is, of course, what I've spent a good part of my life trying to, with the Ottomans, it gets very tricky because to them, like Russia, you're talking about Marx and Engels and their whole generation, Russia was like, I don't know, the United States and the CIA to a Latin American leftist of the last 40 years. They were just the devil. So anything that obstructed Russia from going further into the Balkans and so forth was good. So they actually defend the Ottoman in all the wars and conflicts that take place. They're on the side of the Ottoman Empire more than the Russians, because they see the Russians coming in. They say things like, because one phrase, yeah, the Ottomans are really like decrepit and they're holding on in trust for the revolution that's going to come. But if the Russians take over, that's a more modern form of authoritarianism, and they're going to really like make it more difficult for us. So I think that would be a difficulty for any Turkish Marxist, because Marx actually writes 100 or more pages on the Ottomans in his Tribune writings in the 1850s. But it's all diplomatic and stuff. And they kind of side with Britain and France and the Ottomans in the Crimean War against Russia. So, and then the Asiatic mode of production, yeah, this is I think it's a problematic phrase. I think it goes back to some of those Eurocentric ideas he had in the 1850s. But I think if you think of it negatively, I think it's still useful to simply say that once you get outside Western Europe and the parts of North America that were starting to become capitalist, that there's a different kind of development. We don't have feudalism. We certainly don't have a capitalism. But the whole thing of whether it's pre-capitalist, I mean, even the term, there's no term that's really, I use the term pre-capitalist. It's not really adequate, obviously. All these have problems. But the Asian modes of production, and it's wrong to say he gave it up completely, because you find it already, it's still in Capital Volume 1. It lists several modes of production, the ancient, the Asian, Asiatic. He does list them. I think it's in chapter 1 of Capital. I'll preface the capitalism. So in chapter 1, but it is there. So yeah, it's a problem in this thing. And all problems disappear. Like Marx's veiled or explicit anti-Semitism, we find this in his very last note, or one of the last ones on Egypt in 1882. The finance capital, mainly in the form of British bankers, but also the Rothschilds, coming into Egypt, taking these huge interest rates. And there's one of them is called cave. So he says crocodile cave, but one of them is called Roshan. And he says the user, but he doesn't use the word user to the ones that don't seem to have Jewish names. So it's still some of that kind of, there are lots of problems that are still there. I'm not saying everything is all the criticism. It's not above or beyond criticism, even these late writers.
Right. Jim?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for all your writings. I was reading mostly in article form now for quite a while, and you were little by little answering a question that lied in my mind a while before, which was in the late 1960s already, when I was a student at the London School of Economics and learning my Marxism from people like Ralph Miliband. And it was a wonderful, I had a great introduction there. But sort of at the end of it all, after the expropriators were expropriated and everything like that, they would throw in the letter to Vera Sofilic with a kind of a shrug and he was a mysterious element, Marx, he wrote this thing. He actually thought that the peasant commune in Russia could be, but it was just a hint, and no one really knew what to do with it. There was not then, even among the best Marxists, I think, at its time, a sense of multilinear development. And the other thing that wasn't there, which I had then learned over the subsequent decades, was the category that we would now call the indigenous. And the peasant communes, or the peasant and the peasant communes, say in India and Russia, that Marx was interested in, have elements of indigeneity, we might say now, but they're not really, you can't draw an equal sign of those peasant institutions to what has emerged over these decades as this very complexly articulated, both local, national, and transnational formation that now functions under the sign of the indigenous, a sign that much used and much abused. I think we can all probably agree. But I was trying to learn. I was over the years trying to hold on to my Marxism as much as I could, while getting interested in the emergence of indigenous formations, and the letter to Vera Zasulich, and that was like a hint that I kind of held on to. The other thing I held on to was Gramsci's, who hasn't been mentioned yet tonight, Southern Question, and the one phrase where he talks about Stone Age elements in the coalitional formation of the kind of modern proletarian movement. Stone Age element? I mean, that sounded really like room for primitivism. So I kind of held on to that. And then I started reading your writings, and I realized that there was a lot of Marx that I didn't know about, and that it was providing opening for various forms of multilineal, we can still use the word development. And what had emerged in those years for all of us, because back in the 60s and 70s, in the academy, the word indigenous was not present. You know, you could talk about minority cultures and this and that, but you never had to say indigenous, and you never had to say the phrase settler colonial or anything like that. That has really emerged only in recent decades for all of us. And so I guess so my kind of question is, as you've been working and thinking over these same decades, and now in the present moment, with a newly diverse and multi-directional Marxism, in a context where indigeneity and its modern formations exists. You know, I'm not asking you to say, well, what would Marx think of, you know, the contemporary indigeneity, but I am thinking about what, and if you could have some things to say about the Marxism that you've been making visible, and also translational in the present context. How does that work with indigeneity, and what elements of the indigenous are translatable into a Marxist theoretical formation, and what are actually hostile to it, or simply not, or indigestible? And I think there are certainly elements of the indigenous which are indigestible. We know that native tribes are not archaic. They are very old, deep roots, but they're also very modern. Tribal capitalism is the reality. It is the same capitalism as, you know, other formations. Well, that's an empirical and a theoretical and a political question that is worth dwelling on. So anyway, let's just open up this can of worms and wondering if you've had a few brief reflections.
Oh, okay. Thank you, James. Yeah, this is an unresolved thing in that sort. And one of the big picture things that I couldn't figure out fully how to put together, so I didn't, is that it's specifically in the writings on indigeneity where you find most of the discussion of gender.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you get to the villages, India and Russia, Marx doesn't have any discussion of gender. So particularly in that very non-state, less developed technologically, at least, we can say, a structure. So yeah, there is. I didn't do it, but as people, I hope, go more deeply into. I hope the late Marx really becomes a whole industry of discussion, because I think we really need it today. I think that's one of the things that people are going to have to look at. Now, as far as Marx and Native Americans, I mean, there is that book by, I guess we're allowed to criticize him now because he's no longer being directly persecuted by the state, but after 9/11, but like Ward Churchill has that book, Marx and Native Americans, which is a real hit job on Marx. And I don't know if he was aware of the ethnological notebooks or not, but he, it's a big attempt. Now, this whole thing, though, see, let's take the villages for a second. Okay, you come from a village inside India, and you're driven into the city. Now, Marx says at one point that, nonetheless, some of these forms persist among these social atoms that have been like privatized and individual. So, again, in Turkey, I think a lot of social studies of why this terrible guy Erdogan for a while was getting these large votes was they were saying, well, Istanbul has been inundated by all these people from the villages who have all these backward ideas, quote unquote, and that's why they're voting for Erdogan. So therefore what? They become urbanized, but they retain some of the mentalities, some of the even social structures in the way they self-connect from the village. But yeah, that's true perhaps. There might be some truth in it. But we can also turn that around and say the more collectivist, more communal ways of thinking and living also maybe come with and also stay in the urban center. Think of like La Paz, Bolivia, or, an example that I know well, because I helped get the big edition, the second edition of this book published, Charles Denby, Indignant Heart of Black Workers Journal. Some people might know that, classic labor autobiography. He was a part of the Marxist humanists. So he has a story coming up from Alabama. He'd never been in a union or anything like that. And so it's in the middle of the war. You're not allowed to go on strike, but there's such the labor market is such that workers have a huge advantage. So he gets people together and says, let's all quit our jobs at the same time. Doesn't even know the word strike. And then they get worried and they give them all a raise or whatever they were asking for. What is the point there? The point is, and I think Marx was agreeing with this when he said that, it could be in the village in Russia, which is the starting point. There's one model that I think starts with social democracy in Germany, but you can find it in parts of the left in France and Britain, of an advanced worker. Who's an advanced worker? That's someone who's maybe second or third generation trade union member who's been to the party or trade union school, has political consciousness, and then versus a guy like Denby, who had just come up like 2 weeks ago from the South. But the point is, and Lenin recognized this too, when he said in 1917, when he was trying to push them forward and they didn't want to move to a second revolution, he had this thing, the rank and file of the party is more revolution than the leadership, and the masses outside the party are more revolution than the party. These new people that were politicized and flocking in, that are maybe bringing from villages or other early archaic types of collectivism, communist consciousness, and also they're reacting fiercely against capitalism when they're first experiencing it. So, yeah, I think those are elements, and I think Gramsci had something similar about, the workers migrating up to Turin, the new migrants, being in some ways more revolutionary. So yeah, this is something that needs to be considered, because it's not as though archaic communal conscience, if you want to call it that, disappears just because someone enters San Francisco or New York or Detroit. People carry lots of things with them, even for more than one generation.
Mhm.
The Irish are clannish. They were clannish for a long time, right? Part Irish.
Maybe I'll take the location to jump in too. So I have the question also about the present, but I kind of want to turn the conversation a little bit to the utility of this work for our present. The book really is about, have you can tell now for those of you who haven't read it, the book is really about Marx. It's very Marxological in the sense of trying to go through his notebooks and really reconstruct what he was thinking about. Even if we can't know exactly what he thought, we can at least figure out what he was thinking about in these last periods. But obviously the motivation for doing it and the reason why it has a resonance today probably has less to do with the Marxological questions like, can we get Marx correct? But rather, because it seems to hit a chord with a present problem, a contemporary problem. And that is that for probably especially self-identified leftists in whatever you want to call the global north or places like the United States, it just feels like the so-called core is the last place you would expect for revolutionary energy. It's really, you have to look abroad. You really have to look globally. You have to look to the global south. You're really trying to find, and even within the global north, it's going to be the most marginalized and peripheralized people who are really the source of inspiration, of struggle, of energy, and so on. So if Marx himself thought that, in a sense, the periphery was the place where revolutionary energy was going to begin, in a sense that matters to us today because we have to do, in a sense, the analogous thing today as to what he did then. Rather than try to reconstruct what did Marx think, we have to do what he was doing, but for our present, to think more analogously. But I think there's one tension in that project that is hard for me to see exactly how we can just reproduce exactly what he was doing. Because in all of the conversation where we're asking the question, like, where is the revolution or where is the revolutionary potential? Sometimes that's like an empirical question, as in, where are the places where people are most active and most effective in pushing back against capitalism? But it's also always implicitly a kind of normative question, because not every anti-capitalism is leftist. And so when we ask, like, where's the revolution, it's not just an empirical question. It, in a sense, presupposes a concept of revolution that is not just descriptive, but is in some sense normative and has a commitment to a kind of universalist politics. And that's where it gets extremely tricky, because if you can't recover that secondary dimension, if that itself has been called so significantly into question, then it becomes just an empirical question. And then it's very hard to distinguish it from any valorization of any anti-capitalist movement. And I know from your other work that you're very skeptical about certain kinds of leftist movements, like the book on Foucault. Like, then we're in bed with the Ayatollah. Then it's like anyone who even purports to be anti-capitalist, if we don't carry with us a kind of normative conception of revolution, it can't just be a matter of like deferring to the periphery. So one has to know, to whom would you defer, which specific groups, right? And that has to be determined in advance by some commitment to theory. But if that is itself like being eroded so significantly, then what is left of that dimension of Marxism? And I would say that that's compounded for us in the present by the fact that Marxism is now, unlike in Marx's time, no longer just a kind of intellectual tradition, but a real worldly political phenomenon that has its own historical baggage. It's like a historical event itself that has to be dealt with in some way. It can't just be circumvented as if the whole of the 20th century in the Soviet Union never happened, right? It's like that's now an empirical event that has to be dealt with. As historical materialists, one has to take that into account. So these, to me, are major kind of obstacles to recovering the analogous kind of project in the present to what Marx was trying to do at the end of the 19th century.
We're doing one.
Sean, go ahead.
Maybe I'll move over here so you don't have to like look directly behind your head.
Okay.
Well, yeah, actually building on this, I mean, something that I was thinking about, I haven't yet read the book, so I'll just say that. But like from what I've been gathering from everyone else, and knowing something about your broader project, I mean, I think this question is interesting because it does seem to me that part of this must have to do with thinking about what kinds of resources we can take from late Marx. And even like just thinking about, I don't know, how to be hopeful in situations that might seem really daunting, if not, I mean, certainly challenging in certain ways. I mean, if today it appears, you know, we are not winning at all, and in fact, the other side, in its most extreme form, needs to be winning more than ever and increasingly so, then I wonder if you have something to say about, you know, what we might take from a project like this in this moment, and how we might think of how to begin with some kinds of principles or something to try to organize ourselves in a moment that seems so challenging.
Thank you. Okay,
We're ready. We're waiting to write it down.
Oh, yeah. Let me start with. Well, okay. Let's start with that. Yeah. Well, we're not winning, and not just in the U.S. I mean, some of these recent developments in Latin America, like the elections in Ecuador and was it Bolivia yesterday? You know, it has a lot of problems, obviously, and the Reform Party now being in the polls, I think #1 in Britain. They don't call themselves the National Front anymore, but that group in France. But you know, I come from a tradition that is sometimes a case of subjectivism, but you know, this is also the era of the Gen Z revolution. This is also the era when Donnie, I think, is likely to win the mayoralty of New York City, the biggest city of capital in the world, except maybe London. So I think we have to build on some of those positives because we have to look at. I think that's what Marx was doing, in a sense, that if the revolution is not happening in Europe, in Western Europe, then let's look at the ferment in Russia, because, you know, he wasn't in favor of individual acts of terrorism, but he wasn't unhappy when, you know, the Tsar was assassinated. Other people, you know, and Bereza Zulich, you know, had been involved in that. I mean, even in the manifesto, he points to that, he actually mentions that. Not as in the same way that one might mention that the Hamas attack on October 7th, it certainly, you know, put an end to the idea that, you know, the Palestinian question had been like relegated to the background. They had all been crushed. They'd been walled in. Now we can have the Abraham Accords and have, you know, a generation of peace in the Middle East on imperialist terms. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of resources we can take from Marx, and this really amazing ability that Marx has to look at the global, you know, because we were told, you know, 20, 30 years ago that, you know, not the global, but the local. But Marx does both. His dialectic holds both of those, because as I said before, I know a lot of people won't agree with this point, but he takes this from Hegel, actually, with the concrete universal, as opposed to some kind of abstraction in the Platonic type of universe. Okay, so yeah, okay, Robert, comments. Yeah, in a certain sense, the core is the last place where, in recent years, the revolutionary uprisings and ferment have occurred, with the exception of some of these marginalized ethnic communities. You think of the French uprising of 2023 that no one even pays attention to. That was really, really significant. 800 police stations came under attack in a couple days. I mean, I don't think even in the 60s in America it was to that extent. And what's really interesting is the French left has reconstituted itself to a certain extent. They're discussing Palestine. They're discussing this, the neoliberal politics of the government and the raising of the retirement age. That's being contested. But these events are not mentioned that much, as there's somewhat of a critique of the police by the Mélenchon and some of those further left groups. But the trade unions certainly aren't taking that any more than they are here. Okay, so what does it mean for today to look at this stuff? Okay, well, France, which I guess mentioned, France is really interesting, and we shouldn't mythologize it because France is a really conservative country in some ways. But France is a place where we've had the trade union upsurges and really strong movements a couple of years ago. And while it seemed like it was crushed, it's now forced the government to fall and maybe not be able to stay in even this new iteration. We have an actual left-wing political party and alliance that is able to, in the elections of 2 years ago, they got more votes than the far right. And then we also have what I was mentioning, this immigrant rights and anti-police brutality protest. Now in France, they say the convergence des luttes, the convergence of the struggles, but it doesn't really happen. It happens only in the sense of the lowest common denominator, that we all have to unite against Macron or against the retirement plan. There isn't enough specific mention of race, of police brutality, and so forth. So I think, but that's where some of the initiative is nonetheless coming from. So one of the things you can take from my book, I hope, is that when you look at some of those forces where they may not even consider themselves socialists at all. Those if you ask those youth why you're rising, they might not have even used that word most, but yet it has so much of that content. And we can say when someone like Mamdani comes in, which he probably will, the two things to watch in terms of what are the kinds of compromises he's going to make. One is going to be obvious to everyone in this room, is he really going to take on any kind of tax on the wealthy or any even small reform thing that targets big capital? Will he try to do it, and will he be able to with the governor and the city council? And the second one, I think it's very clear, he's already done it. He's retreated almost completely from any kind of reform of the police, let alone transferring a good part of the police over to people that simply show up when someone is mentally disturbed and shouting on the streets without packing 45 revolvers and stuff. But, he's retreated almost completely from that. Which if Bernie Sanders had really come out forcefully on that and told when Rahm Emanuel said, I don't support you, he should have said, I repudiate your support, because you were like the mayor of the police, and we don't agree with that. But Sanders is a different kind of politics in there. Okay, but I think there's still a lot of radicalism, anarchism, various kinds of decolonial, post-colonial, post-structuralist. There's all kinds of radicalism that's non-Marxist, and that is even critical of Marx. And I think some of those, if you say, Marx is against the free market, well, a lot of young people are going to say, so what? In the state, because in the neoliberal order, there's a lot of people who would like to see the state strengthened and more schools and more social welfare. But if you say Marx is Eurocentric and didn't have anything to say about gender and is a white male of the 19th century, then, I think newer generations are just going to say, wow, this is nonsense. They're going to cancel this. So I think there is, because anti-Marxism and critique of Marxism, especially in the United States above all, is kind of like it's an ideology. So we have to I do regard my work as trying to respond to that and undermine that, because I think just to open up to younger people that we need to read Marx. And then, which one said it? Oh, yeah, it was also Robert. But of course, what's very seldom addressed when people return to Marx, and we're sitting in this room too, I think for the most part doing it, there was this revolution in Russia, there was one in China, there were other ones, and they were conducted in the name of Marxism. Angola, I just wrote about that. One of my first writings was about that. So, where have they turned out? Marxism in power has to be analyzed and critiqued. We just can't. It's insufficient to say Lenin didn't understand the critique of the Gotha. I mean, it's true. It's necessary, but somehow 100 books every year appear on fascism, and this is before Trump. But 2 books appear a year on Stalinism, and we really have, because even though Stalinism per se is over with, a lot of the ways that Putin and what we call the campus left talk about Ukraine and something, it's really repeating a lot of the old Stalinist framework. So that needs to be looked at. And so, yeah, I do think we need to read critically Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, Gramsci, all these thinkers after Marx. If we're going to be Marxists today, we can't just reinvent the wheel by, okay, let's read Capital, let's read Marx, and then go straight to today. But that's a huge project. And my book, this book was supposed to be like 1 chapter on Marx before the late Marx, which became 5, so there had to be a 7th. And then there was to be 1 chapter on the late Marx. And then, because the fellowship I got was also to cover like Franz Fanon, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, and all these other people up to today. I'm never going to write that book. So this is and I started this like 1996. I started seriously research, and I didn't finish the book then. So there's so much here, but I think we really ignored our peril, the history of Marxism as well as Marxist direction.
Okay, that's a great note to end on. Thank you.